Okay, the video is live now. That's great. So, be able to switch this briefly to. So, welcome. I'll ask a few technical things before we begin. My name is Mark Hathaway. I'm the Executive Director of the Jesuit Forum, and we're delighted to have so many people with us today from so many different places. And I think it's going to be a great webinar with Leslie and Nettie today. Just as kind of a few technical things. I think if people can turn off, if you're not one of the speakers, if you can turn off your cameras and mute your sound, it will be helpful. We're not doing this with Zoom webinars, so it's a little bit more difficult in that sense in terms of. And I'm just going to try to see if there's a way that I can hide the non-video. I'm not seeing a setting for that to hide the non-video participants. Maybe Victoria, you can kind of see if you can find a setting for that in the view, perhaps, just so we can get those. So if you're not, so I ask people basically to turn off your cameras, and hopefully we can hide the non-video participants. Just trying to see. I think there's actually maybe here. I think I found it. Okay. So we're so happy to have everyone here today, and particularly, of course, Nettie and Leslie, who have been so generous to join us and to be with us. Since we're not using the webinars, we're using meetings in order to put questions today. If you have a question, you can use the chat function. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen and mouse over, you'll see a chat, and you can open that up. And so any questions, and also I'm going to be asking for people to put something else in chat and very soon, that's where you do that. For those who are watching on YouTube, you can also use the live feed on YouTube to do that. In terms of, so as I say, generally keep your mic and video off. And we're going to begin at this point with a land acknowledgement that Trevor Scott from the Jesuit Forum team is going to lead us in. But I'd also ask that during that land acknowledgement, if people want to in chat, you can put whose traditional territory you're coming from today. And so that way we'll get some idea about where different people are coming from. So it's a way to be a bit more interactive. So Trevor, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So let us begin by acknowledging the sacred lands upon which we meet. We acknowledge this land as a living community and all of its inhabitants, the animals, birds, water creatures, insects, fungi, microbes, all of whom sustain life. The territories where we are gathered have been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years. The land from where I speak is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Onondaga, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And now this land is presently known as the Toronto area. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations. The image here is of one spoon in one dish, where the dish represents the living land of the Great Lakes. There is one spoon, meaning that we must share and care for this land justly and peaceably, making sure that all have what they need and taking no more than what we truly need for ourselves. And now I invite you, for those of you from different territories presently, to briefly name the peoples who have traditionally inhabited the land where you are, and the treaties, if you know them, that you are part of, and just down in the chat box. And I'll ask you to continue doing that as you have time. Today, we meet on all of these lands, which are still the home of myriad living beings and the home of many indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge all of them with gratitude and remember our sacred responsibilities as treaty peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. And I'll introduce the Jesuit Forum a little bit. The Jesuit Forum takes seriously the proposition that social transformation begins in the hearts and minds of people. We promote small group dialogue circles with an emphasis on listening to others as a way to awaken social imagination and ecological sensitivity. We believe in an active hope that engages people to want to live differently. We envision a world in which we can all live well in a vibrant, diverse, and regenerated Earth community. In addition to facilitating small groups, the Jesuit Forum produces dialogue guides that help groups discern the signs of the time and understand the complexities of the many social and ecological justice issues we face. For example, in one of our guides, Living with Limits, Living Well, we explore new ways of envisioning well-being, departing from restrictive measures of gross domestic product and economic growth to uncover more meaningful ways of appreciating genuine life-centered development. This is based on concepts that many Indigenous peoples throughout Abayala or the Americas have traditionally sought to live well or buen vivir, or to live the good life. In Andean cultures, the Sumac Kawasai speaks of human flourishing within the context of community, focusing on the quality of relationships rather than opposition, accumulation, linear progress, or consumption. In Anishinaabe culture, the Mino Bima Disiwin conveys the idea of a worthwhile, fulfilling life, a way of walking on a straight path, a lived life, the fullest, including health, not only for oneself, but for all of one's relationships. So with that, I leave you with Mark, who is going to introduce the subject of food sovereignty today and get us started on our conversation.
So food sovereignty, why food sovereignty? Why is this important? I think food is something that, all of us literally connect with every day. I mean, it's such a visceral thing. It's part of our lives. And it's also often associated with, gatherings and community and celebration. So it has both a physical and kind of a cultural or spiritual side to it as well. It just is such an important part of life, really. And food production is, I think, probably the most important human economic activity on Earth. I mean, most of us, fortunately, can still breathe the air, even though that's in some places becoming more questionable. And we might have to pay something for water, but food is the thing that it takes a lot of work to produce it, to prepare it, to transport it. There's a lot of that goes into that basic sustenance of life, and yet it is a real essential. It's not just like a commodity. It's not a luxury. It's an absolute essential thing to life. About half of the world's people are actually involved in agriculture still. And about half of those people are women, something that sometimes we don't always associate to. Sometimes there's an idea in people's mind that most farmers are men. That's not true. There's lots and lots of women farmers throughout the world. And about 95% of them are in the global south. And nearly about half of, somewhere around 40% or 50% of the land surface of the earth is involved in some sense in agriculture or food production or forestry production. And really, it's the human activity that has the biggest ecological footprint on Earth. By some estimates, up to half of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with food production. That includes everything from emissions from soil and fertilizer use and machinery use, transportation, land use changes, food waste. There's a whole bunch of things. And what's more, about 85% of our freshwater use is associated with agriculture as well. There's a fair amount, sometimes there's, agricultural runoff has a lot to do with water degradation, biodiversity loss, the use of pesticides. So a lot of these are particularly associated with what we would call industrialized agriculture, kind of the modern kind of agriculture that emerged kind of after World War II in particular. Now, on the one hand, that system, some would argue, has brought us plentiful food, like lots of food, and in fact, it is true, not just industrial food, because a lot of the food we eat actually doesn't come from that system. But what is true is that we actually produce enough food for everyone on this planet. But we also know that despite the fact that we're probably producing more than enough food for everyone, that there's still a lot of people who go hungry or who are suffering malnutrition or have inadequate food or food that's poor quality. And we also know that in this kind of COVID time, it has made us very aware of how globalized our system is and how interdependent and how those supply lines can be interrupted. We've become more aware perhaps of migrant farm labor and how dependent we've become on that. So I think a key question is it possible to produce enough quality food for everyone who needs it and to distribute that justly in a way that doesn't harm the planet, and since I'm the eternal optimist, that might actually be regenerative or to actually contribute to biodiversity or to sequestering carbon in soil, for instance. And that really, I think, gets to the heart of this whole idea of food sovereignty, which is about food for people, building knowledge and skills, working with and regenerating nature, valuing food producers, including many of the people who produce our food, be they migrant food laborers or people in the global south or farmers struggling with debt, aren't able to actually have a good livelihood out of that. Is it possible too? Food sovereignty has to do with localizing food system, restoring local control, and treating food as a sacred gift. So we're really delighted and very grateful today to have two wonderful guests, Leslie Campbell and Nettie Wiebe, who are going to be joining us in this conversation. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from both of them. But I'm going to turn this over right now to Victoria now to introduce Leslie, and then Leslie's also going to add some things to that.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce Leslie. Leslie is a food justice advocate with a background in tropical agroecology and community food security. As a student, Leslie spent a year in northern Thailand managing an organic farm and developing an agricultural training curriculum, which inspired him to pursue a master's degree in geography, focused on the social and ecological aspects of food systems. He then returned overseas, spending 2 years teaching agriculture in Indonesia and 2 years working in agricultural research and training in Ethiopia, after which Leslie returned to Canada, excited to engage with food issues more locally. Leslie now works for Food Share Toronto, where he supports community-led food access initiatives, research, and advocacy. This work seeks to broaden conversations about food insecurity to include discussions of the many systems of oppressions that hold it in place. Systems like colonialism, capitalism, systematic racism, and patriarchy. Leslie is also a director of the board of Make Way, formerly Tides Canada, is a member of the Toronto Food Policy Council, and works as a food systems research consultant. He believes strongly in income-based solutions to food security as implemented alongside universally accessible public services and in the need for those most impacted by these issues to lead the solution-finding process. With that, Leslie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what has inspired your work or advocacy around food justice?
Sure, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Victoria. Greetings, everyone. It's really wonderful to join you in this space this evening for this conversation. By way of, I guess, additional introduction, I was hoping to be able to tell you a little bit of add to some of the details about kind of how I got to this space with my work and in my life. And so my story began north of Toronto in the suburbs of Markham, where I grew up, living in the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. As a child, my maternal grandmother, Joan Winter, would pull me into her lap and tell me stories about what it was like for her growing up in rural Alberta during the Great Depression in Lethbridge, and how she used to spend her summers helping her father on the farm at the University of Lethbridge. And she told me that farming was in our family, and she taught me that stories were important. I also grew up going to church and was taught in those spaces to do unto others as I would have others do unto me, and took that messaging to heart. I also spent time on farms growing up, on field trips and visits with my family. The farmers, looking back, the farmers we interacted with almost never looked like me. They were almost always older white men. But despite not seeing myself perhaps reflected in those spaces, these sorts of experiences also inspired me to explore food further in school and led me to study tropical food systems, specifically focusing on coffee and coffee agroforestry systems. And as I worked my way through school and university and grad school, navigating these academic spaces, then my classmates and I were taught both implicitly and explicitly to see the world through a Western scientific lens. We were taught that data is valuable and decision-making should be based on quantifiable empirical evidence and Western science. These were all framed as the right ways to do things. I note that we were not taught in the same way that these ways of seeing and knowing were just one of many valid ways of understanding and navigating the world. This I had to learn much later. After leaving school, I was drawn to agriculture work in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and East Africa, where I finally had the opportunity to live and work and learn alongside farmers who looked more like myself, and who were drawing from practices and wisdom that was fundamentally different from the Eurocentric mindset that I had been taught to value in school. I noted as we were logging in that someone, at least one person mentioned that they were tuning in from Costa Rica, which is another place that I spent some time studying coffee agroforestry systems. So that is also quite near and dear to my heart. And over the years, working alongside these farmers, learning about traditional agriculture practices and grappling with different ways of practicing agriculture in different parts of the world, I began to recognize that in these contexts, my skills as someone from Canada were really highly valued in the eyes of others. And in that context, what I said carried a lot of weight, I noted. And it was really good to be listened to, especially coming out of school as a relatively young person and being seen as an expert in that field. And looking back, in retrospect, I recognized that I should have been spending much more of my time with my mouth shut, simply listening, learning, and amplifying what I was hearing from community members more knowledgeable than I, who were speaking about the things that they saw and had experienced. As a result of this growing recognition, although I loved the work that I was doing working in the tropics, in 2016, I made the difficult choice to leave this work and to return home to apply my skills more locally. And in seeking work back here in Canada, I was drawn to Food Share Toronto, which was a name that I heard come up again and again in discussions about food work. And I was drawn to the organization because it was an organization that was talking about food insecurity, which I cared about and had witnessed the impact of both in Canada and internationally working overseas. But in addition, they were also talking about systemic oppressions like racism and patriarchy and colonialism and capitalism. The sorts of things that I and people in communities like mine disproportionately experience, but that I had never seen held up publicly as an important part of the larger conversation about food systems. It just felt right. The organization was led by somebody with lived experience that reflected the communities that it worked alongside. And the programs that were being run were prioritized based on the experiences of the people who needed them. I did not know it at that time, but I was seeing food justice work up close for the first time. In the spirit of having kind of a shared definition, just so that we have a shared understanding to guide our conversation, food justice recognizes the food system as a intentional project and seeks to look at the influence of race and class and other associated systems of oppression on the production, distribution, and consumption of food. It also recognizes that food justice recognizes that systems like patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, and systemic racism are key determinants in who faces the most food insecurity and who gets to lead the solution finding process in discussions about food insecurity. It's difficult work. It pushes us to go further in addressing food insecurity and focuses on the systemic issues that hold food insecurity in place. And so in my work with Food Share, I now support research, advocacy, and community-led projects, all designed to address barriers to food access for communities that face these barriers in accessing the money that they need for food. So wonderful to be here, and thanks for that introduction.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was great and really interesting to hear about your journey. I think it's really important to hear those stories to understand, how I think our learning journeys through life really inform who we are and what we can give, and those stories are really important to share. I'd like to now introduce Nettie Wiebe, who I've known now, I think, for nearly 20 years. I mean, obviously, we were both extremely young when I first met her, but Nettie's an amazing person because she's done so many different kinds of things. She farms near Delisle, Saskatchewan, growing organic grains and pulse crops, raising cattle. She's served in leadership positions in the National Farmers Union, done some wonderful work there, and also through that and expanding out wider, and it is this whole thing of the Via Campesina, which was really a global movement, particularly of smaller farmers, and really I think an important global food sovereignty movement, probably the largest and most one in the world. She also has worked with the UN Committee on Rural Food Security in Rome. She's been an active participant in public discourse around sustainable agriculture and rural communities, women's equality, human rights, food sovereignty. She's taught in a theological college in Saskatoon, so ethics as well. One time I first met Nettie when we were doing work together in the United Church around genetically modified foods and things, and Nettie was a wonderful resource on that. She's also been published most recently in for instance, an academic textbook on reaching beyond hunger, the right to food and food sovereignty, and recently received an honorary doctorate from the University of Alberta, which, congratulations, Nettie, but well-deserved. But so it really is a delight to have Nettie with us today. And I'd really like to hear, Nettie, a bit of your personal journey. What got you interested in food and food sovereignty issues and food justice? how did that start and where did it lead you?
Thanks, Mark. A very fulsome introduction there. What got me interested in food? Eating, of course, eating. I love to eat, but I also grew up on a farm, and in a farm, a mixed farm in Saskatchewan in the Prairie region of Canada, in the midst of a large and wonderful family. And so farming is very much my roots and my origins. And I have farmed all my life. I think I've missed maybe a handful of harvests in my life. So in my own way, farming is very much part of growing food, and cooking is very much part of who I am and how I have always been. But just growing food and cooking and eating doesn't necessarily engage one in the discourse around food justice and a critical examination of how the food system is organized and for whom and for what. So I must say that I first became politicized when we were farming with my parents in the late 70s, early 80s, and there was the prospect of a uranium refinery in our neighborhood. And we organized to oppose it. It was good farmland, and there are lots of reasons to be skeptical about the uranium industry, the nuclear industry as such. But what that first initial political engagement at the neighborhood level taught me and opened for me was the power of collective action, because we actually stopped against all the odds the building of that refinery in our neighborhood. And it also emphasized for me something that I've always known and have worked with all my life, and that is that we live in ecological systems, and our activism is always, our environment is always the context of our activism. So collective action, environmentalism, and an engagement in farming. So when we started farming on our own, my partner and I, in the early 80s, we were in an era, and you all, those of you who were alive then, recall that the early 80s was a time when there was a real push globally and here in Canada for a kind of system of neoliberalism. And when we started farming, what we were experiencing was the dismantling of the programs and the policies which had kept small-scale farmers in the game, if you were, that had allowed small mixed farmers to operate across Canada. That was being dismantled along with social protections. I mean, this was the Mulroney, Thatcher, Reagan, neoliberal ideology dominating. And it meant that social protections were being unraveled, farm marketing and support systems were being undone, and there was a real consolidation of corporate concentration, particularly in agriculture. So one of the things that became clear to me was that we needed to work together as farmers, and that's when we joined the Farmers Union, the National Farmers Union, because actually we were interdependent with our environment, of course, but also socially and politically interdependent. The other thing that early activism taught me, and which is indisputable, and Mark has already mentioned it, is that when it comes to food and food production and food provisioning and cooking, women have a key and central role. Household food security, how we eat, what we eat, whether we get good desserts is often the function of who's in the kitchen. And this remains true today, overwhelmingly. The dominant actors in the kitchen are women. So as a woman farmer, that seemed to me a very important piece to take along with me when we were looking at food and food systems. That's my background.
Thank you so much, Nettie. So now we're going to move on to our kind of key questions for the day. And feel free to kind of innovate and move around them. I think they're meant to be broad questions. So the first one really is, what is this food sovereignty thing? Why is it important? And how does it maybe relate to things around food security, food justice, sustainability? And how is it maybe different than the dominant paradigm that we're seeing? So I'll throw that out as the first question. And I don't know, perhaps Leslie, you'd like to begin with that.
Sure. Yeah, happy to take these are big questions, so you'll forgive me if I take some time to get into some of the nuances. But I guess to begin in further to the spirit of shared definitions, because I think that often terms like food security and food sovereignty are used interchangeably, and it's important to recognize that they're distinctive things. So specific to food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is, as I see it, is more about kind of the right of people to culturally appropriate and healthy food that is ideally produced through means that are ecologically sound and sustainable, and has to do with the right of people to define their own food and agriculture systems, and that does draw directly from the definition that was, I believe, developed by Livia Campesina, which I'm sure Nettie is able to speak to as well. But within kind of food sovereignty, there are 7 general pillars in talking about it. And so I'm happy to kind of share some of those pillars, and so we can use that to frame our discussion. So I mean, the first pillar is about kind of food for people. It's about putting people's need for food at the center of policies, and insists that food is treated as more than just a commodity. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is about building knowledge and skills. And so food sovereignty is designed to build on traditional knowledge and to recognize the inherent value in that knowledge. And uses things like research to support and pass this knowledge on to future generations. Food sovereignty is also about working within nature. So I mean, one of the things I really appreciated about Nettie's introduction is the recognition of the fact that wherever we are, whatever we're doing, we're operating within natural systems. And I think that there is so often this tendency to consider ourselves in the 21st century as separate from nature, or having risen above the need to rely on natural systems, when in fact we are still very much always at all times working within those systems, and that's important to remember. Additionally, food sovereignty values food providers. It's about focusing on the folks and the systems that are supporting our food systems, and it's about sustainable livelihoods, and respecting the work of all food providers. Mark sort of referenced in the introduction, talking about the way that COVID has driven home the recognition of the extent to which here in Canada, at least, then our agricultural systems are so dependent in many areas on migrant agricultural labor, and the ways in which that system has kind of been laid bare, and the gaps in that system have been laid bare by COVID. And so that is also a part of food sovereignty. It's also about localizing food systems, and this is about physically reducing the distance between food providers and consumers, and rejects ideas like dumping and inappropriate food aid, and food sovereignty resists dependence on remote and unaccountable corporations. So that's the fifth, about localizing food systems. The sixth pillar of food sovereignty is about putting control locally, placing control in the hands of local food providers, and recognizing the need to inhabit and share territories as we seek to meet our food needs. It's also about rejecting the privatization of natural resources. And then the seventh pillar of food sovereignty is about the fact that food is sacred. It recognizes that food is a gift of life and is not something to be squandered. And it asserts that food cannot and should not be commodified. And in my thinking, this is where a lot of the elements about sustainability are fit in here, because I think that although it's not an explicit pillar of food sovereignty, I think that sustainability is key to food sovereignty within a particular community, so that communities are able to rely on access to food resources now and in the future. And so now that we've sort of got a shared definition, we can begin to think about why there is a need for and what is the importance of food sovereignty. And ultimately, food sovereignty supports food security for communities. This food security in many communities has been impacted and lost over time as the result of things like the intentional destruction of Indigenous foodways and traditions, which here in Canada was one of the tools of colonization used to repress Indigenous communities here. And there are other examples of that from other countries also. It's also the result of the exploitation of the labor of people of African descent. And I think that kind of the legacy of that history is one of the things that we see manifesting itself in higher rates of food insecurity within the Black community here in Canada. And I think it's important to recognize that the root causes of food insecurity are about a lack of access to money. Food insecurity is about kind of lack of access to food, but that is ultimately about lacking the access to the money that you need to buy the food. And so it's about poverty. And who experiences poverty is a function of many of these larger systems of oppression. And I can, I guess, give you a quick example from my work at FoodShare. So FoodShare runs different programs, all designed to promote food access. And one of these programs is called a Good Food Market program, which sells low-cost, reasonably priced fruits and vegetables in neighborhoods across the city of Toronto. FoodShare has long led this program, and it's universal, so anyone can access. But we've always noticed that the program is, and many of our programs are disproportionately accessed by Black, Indigenous, and other racialized folks. This also reflects what we have heard over our 35-year operating history from people about what barriers their communities were facing in accessing the foods and that they need and the money that they need to buy food. So in response to this, in 2019, then FoodShare formed a partnership with the Proof Food Insecurity Research Team at the University of Toronto to dig into this question about kind of food insecurity a little bit further. And the study was guided by the question, looking in Canada, how do Black and white communities in Canada differ in their food insecurity risk? The study looked through Canada Community Health Survey data and analyzed that data through the lens of race. And so the findings of the study really reflected kind of what community members and community leaders within the Black community had been saying for years, and what many folks within these communities already knew. The study found, for example, that Black households in Canada are 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white households. The study also found that 10% of white households in Canada are food insecure, compared with 28% of Black households. This is work that FoodShare did focused specifically on the Black community, but I want to recognize that similar trends have been found by others looking in other communities in Canada, like the Indigenous community, for example. So a 2019 study noted that almost 60% of Indigenous identifying households reported facing some form of food insecurity in communities that are remote or lacking year-round access. And so, I mean, this is compared to basically these rates of food insecurity within the Indigenous community were found to be approximately 3 times higher than among non-Indigenous households. So these findings all suggest that food is, and access to food is radically different across social lines. And these lines often include race. And these findings really capture the way that systems like structural racism and colonialism work together to determine who faces the greatest barriers to access the money they need for food. And as such, working towards food sovereignty within food insecure communities is one avenue to address these imbalances.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That's. I mean, I think the issues you've highlighted are really, really important, and I'll turn things over to Nettie now to add her reflections about what is food sovereignty, why is it important, and how might it look different from the current system that we have.
Thanks, Leslie, for that very succinct description of what the definitions around food sovereignty are. Let me just back up and give you some history and some background on how we developed this whole terminology of food sovereignty. I was one of those people who was in on the ground floor of this. Turn back to the mid-90s, late 80s, early 90s. And globally, what was going on was that there was trade negotiations. They were called the GATT negotiations, which for the first time included agriculture. But we in Canada, of course, had a trade agreement, the Canada-US trade agreement, that had already included agriculture. So we as farmers in Canada already understood that these trade agreements were actually a power grab, a corporate power grab for agribusiness, and would have devastating effects on, particularly on small scale family farming. So we had that experience. When those negotiations happened globally, progressive peasant organizations around the world recognized that what was happening around the trade table was going to have profound and devastating effects in their own communities, and that some sort of resistance had to be mounted to what was going on. And that was the genesis of the formation of the Via Campesina. For the first time, a global movement of small-scale farmers, peasants, indigenous peoples who got together and decided that they would speak for themselves, and they were no longer going to be spoken for by NGOs, development organizations, and for sure not be spoken by the agriculture departments of their governments, because many of those departments, many of those negotiators were already completely enamored with the global neoliberal project of creating global, efficient, industrialized food systems, which would, as I said, undermine and devastate small-scale community food systems. So that was the context in which the Via Campesina was formed. And in our first major meeting, we formed in 1993, but I was the president of the Farmers Union at that time here in Canada. So we in Canada and our Mexican counterparts hosted in Mexico the first big delegated Via Campesina convention assembly, at which we struggled mightily, I must say, all night, with sometimes 7, 8 translators in the room, trying to find a way in which we could express succinctly what it was that we understood to be a fundamental problem in the neoliberal, the GATT negotiation project, which was the shift of power. And so we struggled about the language, how we would express that. And the language of food sovereignty, which we landed on, is distinct from the food security language. Food security is a kind of a neutral term. Food sovereignty specifically politicizes the language, because we understood at that time, and Mark said this in the beginning, we understood there is enough food in the world. It's a question of who controls the food, who controls the markets, who controls the resource base, who owns the land, who controls the water, and increasingly, who's in control of the seeds and the genetics. So we understood that this is not just a production problem. This is a democracy problem, a power problem, a political problem. And that's what the food sovereignty term actually emphasizes. And in that very year, in 1996, in March, we coined the term and started using it. And by October that year, the World Food Summit was happening in Rome. And as expected, the main summit where the governments were meeting were all standing around wringing their hands about the increasing number of hungry in the world, and offered the solution which we had anticipated they would offer. What we need here is to ramp up production. And then, and this was also anticipated, then the corporate players that had a key interest in this stepped up to the plate and said, we have the solution. It's genetic modification. Voila, we can actually increase production and that will solve the hunger problem. Whereas we in the Via Campesina said immediately, no, that might be this food, the solution you have to what you assume to be the food insecurity problem. That is not where the problem is. The problem is with who controls it and where the decisions are made and who's deciding who eats and who doesn't and what it's going to cost to eat. So it's not just a production problem. It's not just a distribution problem. It is in fact a problem of power, of democracy. And since then, Mark, I've probably used up my time here, but since then we have watched as a matter of fact that there's been a greater consolidation of that global power and that food systems are more and more in danger. And if there's anything that this pandemic has exposed, it's that the systemic problems that were already there are augmented and exposed by this pandemic. I'm not sure, Mark, you probably want to move on here, but we can talk some more about what these problems are and how food sovereignty is in fact a much more likely and a necessary solution to them rather than the productivist, technical, industrial, and corporate solutions that are being offered all around.
No, I think that's exactly where we want to go now, which is great, Nettie. You've really set us up nicely because I think, yeah, it's almost like if you think back to the feudal system, the way large corporations, I mean, it's both being now controlled through things like the quote unquote inputs, like things like fertilizers and pesticides and all those things, genes, like patenting genes, and also massive land grabs. I mean, there's all those things kind of going on that I think, are as you say, it's a power problem. So if we think about food sovereignty, I think it's really helpful to kind of think out what do we want to move toward? Like what might food sovereignty look like in practice? How would it address some of these problems around injustice, unequal distribution, power, and sustainability all at the same time, and actually move toward a more regenerative form of agriculture, for instance. So I'll let I won't determine the speaking order, but I'll just kind of see who begins and turn it over to you. So
Leslie, can I jump in here?
Please do.
All right. Because we as small-scale producers and peasants around the world understand where we come from and we understand what is happening and how these decisions made elsewhere for corporate profit are in fact often enormously destructive, and they have consequences that were unforeseen. I mean, a lot of this tremendous and often deep-seated admiration for technical solutions is in fact, it has consequences. It has residual consequences which are often not foreseen. And when foreseen are somehow dismissed because they're happening to people elsewhere in the world, and they're not our people, as it were. They're out of the decision-making realm. So one of the things around food sovereignty is that the redistribution of power, the resistance against the power grabbing, is also an assertion that everybody matters and everybody ought to be able to eat. No? And that this is our common human project. We have, and this is the language we use, we have the right to food. This isn't a charitable offering from somebody. This is a right as human beings. And then our big challenge is, how do we organize our food systems and our society and our social relations, and increasingly, obviously, our ecological embeddedness in such a way that, in fact, that right can be realized. I mean, one of the very persuasive arguments that was always made around further industrialization and further corporatization is that it is more efficient. And if we're not more efficient, we won't be able to feed everybody. And you hear this as a recurring kind of mantra. But we should just keep in mind that efficiency maximizes catastrophe. And now in this pandemic, that's what I said earlier when I said it's being exposed. The efficiencies that we have, the stupendous efficiency, for example, of having only 2 major beef processors in the country, 3, one in Guelph, but really 70% of the beef being processed in this country is processed by Cargill and JBS. Well, during this pandemic, when those enormously high throughput, efficient operations hit the snag of the pandemic, then they were also sites of catastrophe. And the ripple effect on our farm and on many farms is that we are so dependent, the industry, the beef industry is so dependent on those few huge players that have destroyed all of the local abattoirs in most of the country, most parts of the country, that there's a lot of strain in the system now. There's a lot of very good beef on the hoof that will never get to the table, or will get there in a different, way late, because we were so efficient. So we need to critically examine how these kinds of systems actually concentrate power under often false pretenses. Sorry, I jump in here, Leslie.
I think it's so. Leslie, what are your thoughts on this?
I guess my first thought is that was beautifully said, Nettie. I am just kind of sitting over here, nodding my head vigorously to everything you're saying. I mean, I feel like one of the ideas that keeps coming up again and again in this conversation is this idea about food sovereignty and what it might look like being about our need to question and deconstruct these sort of dominant narratives that shape agriculture and food policy. I think it looks like yeah, reframing the idea that agriculture needs to be about profit maximization at all costs, that sort of thing. And it looks like communities, I think, especially minority communities like Indigenous communities and the Black community, taking back control of their food and their food systems. And it looks like abandoning a capitalist approach to our food systems, because I think that's been proven that it's not really working. Industrial food systems, as we currently see them, are sort of a natural offshoot of this capitalist approach to food production. The prioritization of monocrops or single crop models based on economies of scale, where the most efficient way of farming is seen as having as much land and as much land under production as possible. This idea of externalization of environmental impacts of agricultural production are also kind of part of this model, as well as the deprioritization of animal welfare as part of industrial farm and meat production systems. And kind of the prioritization of short-term return on investment, as opposed to, say, long-term sustainability. I always come back to this quote that one of my soil science professors in university liked to quote, and it was, "You can't build soil in a season. You simply can't. It is a process that takes many years." And so this idea of having a multi-generational approach to agriculture is much more in line with ideas of food sovereignty and with valuing sort of more traditional approaches to agriculture. And so it's about shifting from this kind of narrative of how can we produce food as cheaply and profitably as possible to a narrative that aligns more with this idea of kind of how can we produce more diverse, nutritious, healthy, culturally appropriate foods by working with nature in a manner that is just and equitable and serves communities. And so, I mean, within that model, that food sovereignty model, then diversity is the bedrock of a resilient food system. And I feel like Nettie's example of the Cargill and JBS meat processing is a beautiful example of this. If we sort of reduce our reliance to a few specific, especially corporate players, then often we find ourselves in a really difficult situation when there is a bottleneck in the supply chain. And we are much more, it leads to a much less resilient food system. And I also think it's important to note that like community health and human health and well-being are really central to the idea of food sovereignty. And kind of food and food systems being seen as tools or opportunities to allow communities to heal from a history of oppression. To heal from a history of land-based aggression or forced migration or colonialism, that sort of thing. And so I think, yeah, I guess that would be where I kind of left that in terms of what food sovereignty might look like in practice. I have some thoughts on what kind of allyship can look like in that context as well, but might leave those until later on in the conversation if that's appropriate.
Mark, can I just jump in here?
Sure. Go ahead.
That we don't lose something very important that we need to revisit over and over again that Leslie said, and that's that whole concept of diversity. In some ways, I think we've been misguided in how we see diversity, and that somehow there's a lot of language about we tolerate diversity. We don't need to tolerate diversity. We need to cherish it because it is actually the key to resilience and regenerative agriculture and regenerative communities, resilient communities. And I think our supermarket model of food has in some ways misguided us into thinking, duped us into thinking that we're actually experiencing a lot of diversity because we have bananas from Honduras and grapes from Chile and all kinds of things which make us think that actually we're eating in a very diverse food system. And the undercurrent there is that, as a matter of fact, we are we have fewer and fewer options in terms of growing. We are losing traditional seeds. We're losing domestic animal species. We're losing a lot of biodiversity with the monocultures that Leslie already alluded to. So we need to have a much more finely honed, refined sense of what really constitutes diversity in our local context. And as I said, not just tolerate it, but actually cherish it, and in every way possible, respect and take care of it.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, I think, you know, even thinking about ecological resilience, once again, diversity always leads to a stronger system. The more diverse the ecosystem is, but this I think is true around humans as well. The multiplicity of cultures and ways of looking at things and doing things is a strength. It's something to be celebrated, and it actually makes us more resilient in face of things like climate change and challenges that we have. So I think, you know, that in thinking about food sovereignty in practice, yeah, there's just so much there that to kind of try to imagine what that might look like. So there is that question around allyship that we can throw out. We can also begin moving to this question about, you know, what can we actually do to start bringing out about food sovereignty? And one thing that strikes me as kind of a more urban person, you know, I look around and I see in the summer how few people actually grow food in their yards, and how, you know, sometimes there's these vast parklands right next to large, even food insecure communities like apartment buildings, and there's no gardens there. There's no, like, the possibility of this kind of separation also of being, you're either a food consumer or a food producer, but, you know, why aren't we all food producers, sort of a thing. So those are some random thoughts, but I think looking forward to, you know, how can we actually move forward to moving concretely into a food sovereignty paradigm? What are some things that we can do to move away from that industrialized monoculture kind of food as commodity system to a food for people, food is sacred, diversity is wonderful, you know, rebuilding soil, rebuilding communities. What can we do to actually start bringing that about?
You want to take this one first, Nettie, or would you like me?
No, go ahead. I mean, I've spent my life in organization, so the whole question of allyship and joining forces is a key question. So go ahead.
Okay, I guess, but before jumping into the human elements of allyship, I just wanted to take a moment, because this conversation really kind of reminds me of learning about some of the natural allyship that takes place within agricultural systems. And in my graduate research, I studied coffee and coffee agroforestry systems. And I feel like those systems are this beautiful example of what allyship can look like, because coffee is a crop that is evolved to grow in the understory of tropical rainforests, and it's a shade crop, so it thrives in the shade. And so if a farmer is planting coffee in the sun, then the coffee is able to grow, but it requires lots of fertilizer and tends to be more susceptible to disease. And so coffee agroforestry systems are the sorts of systems that have traditionally been used to grow coffee, and they involve growing a tree crop or an overstory crop above the coffee to shade your coffee crop. You can also plant fruit trees in order to harvest fruit from those trees while they also shade the crop. The leaves from the tree, if it's a nitrogen fixing tree, for example, will then nourish the soil surface and provide sustenance to the coffee plants. In the same way, the tree's roots are able to pull nutrients from deep in the soil and recycle them back to the soil surface, so that you have this nutrient cycling taking place in a way that in a less diverse monocrop, you simply don't have the opportunity to see. And I feel like that is just a really beautifully succinct example of the ways in which diversity is strength in a system. To that end, then I think this idea of allyship is really central to the idea of food sovereignty, because although it's really important to recognize that it is voices from communities impacted by food insecurity, from communities that are facing challenges to their food sovereignty that must be held up to lead the fight for food sovereignty, these communities, it's important for these communities to be supported from outside in that struggle. And so when thinking about food sovereignty, I think it's important to think beyond food, and to really kind of look at the systems of oppression that hold these pieces in place. So moving beyond, moving these systems of oppression also enables communities seeking self-determination and independence on their journey as well. And so in that way, like anti-racism work, for example, is an example of food sovereignty allyship work. Work that promotes and creates space for conversations about racism or how to dismantle other types of systemic oppressions is food sovereignty work, because these are systems that stand in the way of community food sovereignty. And so allyship is, to me, fundamentally about listening first and foremost. It's about reflecting and amplifying the messaging that we are hearing come from communities, and about using our power to create space for other voices. And I think it's important to remember that support for a community, especially a community seeking food sovereignty, it's important to provide that support only in the ways that communities request that you show up on their behalf, or alongside them or with them. And historically, many of the challenges of allyship have had to do with, for example, supposed allies dominating the conversation and the narrative. In seeking to be allies, then it's very easy to erase or speak over the voices of the folks that they are supposedly supporting, especially because these voices are often the voices who have been given less power by society. And so it is often so much more important, and this is something that I have had to learn over time, and I have made many mistakes along the way, but it's so often more important to use your power to create the space for others to speak for themselves, as opposed to for you to speak for them. In terms of thinking about like concrete ways of someone seeking to, say, support food sovereignty within a community, especially if they don't belong to that particular community, one simple thing that comes to mind really quickly for me is like supporting Black-owned businesses that champion the work of food sovereignty in their communities is an example of how people who are not Black can demonstrate allyship with the idea of Black food sovereignty. It's about kind of voting with your dollars in support of the world you want to see. And I guess at this point, I'd like to take a moment to hold up an example of an organization here in Toronto that is doing that. There's an organization called Ada Blooms, which is a food business here in Toronto, led by a Black woman operating on behalf of herself and her community. She works with, her name is Abena, and she works with small scale farmers, both in Canada, and sources food from the continent, largely West Africa. And all of the food is kind of with a focus on foods that were ancestrally important within the West African diaspora. And her work is about connecting Black food sovereignty conversations to the work taking place on the continent of Africa. And it's also got this education focus where it works to educate others on the importance of food sovereignty and the importance of valuing ancestral foodways. And I guess I would close just by mentioning that it's although many of the examples that I'm drawing from are from Canada, I want to recognize that this is not just a Canadian conversation. It is taking place all over the world, and the importance of allyship certainly extends beyond these borders. I would also just, as I close, quickly like to shout out a film that I saw last week called Gather. And this is a film that explores indigenous food sovereignty initiatives within the context of the United States, and kind of through kind of profiling indigenous leaders and food system folks who are working to develop programs to resist and push back against the colonial narrative and the erasure of indigenous foodways, to kind of retake that control, as Nettie was saying, of the kind of traditional means that indigenous communities used to access food and to support themselves. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested in hearing more to check out that.
Go ahead, Nettie, anything you want to?
Well, I just want to say that it's always been key, and Leslie mentioned that too, that there's spaces for the communities and the people who are mostly not heard. I mean, if you look at mainstream media, it is mostly urban. We see that in the farm community, it is mostly urban, and it is a fairly small subset of voices that you hear. And one of the objectives of the Via Campesina, and I talked about the formation of the Via Campesina, was specifically that we have our own voice, that we speak for ourselves. And surprising and amazing things are said by people whose voices are so seldom heard. I mean, that's one of the things that's one of the great joys of being part of a bigger community. Then the other thing I'd like to say about this allyship is that there's a distinct difference between solidarity and charity. And we all know that we must be charitable and generous. That's, of course, part of being part of the human community and living well. But it's even more important to be in solidarity because the solidarity relationship is one of equality rather than recipient. So when we talk about in the Via Campesina about our allies, we know that the majority of people by now are not people of the land, are not peasants, are not farming people. But of course, everybody, and that was emphasized at the beginning, are eating people. If you're not eating people, you are not for long on this earth. So you are eating people. So in some ways we have some grounds for solidarity with all of those others who can work to democratize and empower food systems by the way they eat and how they eat, what their relationship to food is. And I was going to say only one thing, but let me say one more thing. One of the things about the global food system is that it delinks you as an eater from the source of that food, from the people who produce it. It erases that relationship, and it's very hard to be in an ethical, caring, solidarity relationship with that which you do not even know of. And so one of the beauties of localizing food systems is that it allows us to be those human beings that are in relationship, not only better relationship with our food, but in relationship with those who produce it, and can be in better solidarity with them.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, maybe I'll just add that as kind of an additional or follow-up question about how to be in solidarity, how to build relationships between what has been almost like a split, this farmer-consumer split, like to actually build relationships between, and also to kind of recover the sense that all of us can contribute in some ways toward food production, but also how can, you know, for those of us who are living in cities, how can we support farmers who want to move toward a more sustainable, more just, more food sovereignty kind of form of producing? Because right now, you know, often the cards are kind of stacked against someone who wants to do something, you know, like to be it organic production, you know, or connecting directly with the community, or trying to do things differently. There's often a lot of barriers to that. So are there ways that we can help support those kinds of initiatives that build connections and build especially kind of local food systems? So
So just if I've got it correctly, the question is sort of what are some ideas of ways to connect people with food systems, and kind of reestablish that connection that Nettie was talking about as being lost as part of the global food system.
Yes.
Reestablish the connection to food and food production. Yeah, that's a really big question, and not a simple one. The first thing I guess I think about, because I am an urban person, I live in a city, and so a lot of the conversation about kind of connecting to the sources of our food in an urban context often focuses on things like farmers markets, and kind of that farm to table, or kind of reestablishing that farm to table linkage, and kind of asking people to go beyond the grocery store to really kind of try to connect to where their food came from. And I think that model is it's one with some potential promise, but I think that one of the major blind spots in that as a potential solution is the fact that in my day-to-day working in food justice here in Toronto, one of the things that we come back to again and again is the fact that people don't have enough money to access food at the grocery store, let alone going to the farmer's market, where often prices are substantially higher, largely because they reflect the many more of the costs that farmers have to incur in producing the food, and that sort of thing. And so I think that in thinking about kind of how to reestablish those connections, it's important to remember the multiple facets in the food system. There's the importance of farmers being able to support themselves and their communities and receive compensation for their labor, but it's also about kind of, again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record here, dismantling the systems of oppression that determine who faces poverty and is therefore not able to perhaps support a local food system in those ways, because the imported lettuce or bananas or whatever at the grocery store are simply cheaper, and that's what they can afford. And so I recognize this piece as important. And I guess I would love to hear some of Nettie's thoughts also on how that connection can potentially be reestablished, whether within an urban context or otherwise.
Yeah, it's a complex question, of course, and I would I wouldn't be giving advice, absolutely not. But here are some thoughts about it. One of the things that that has happened with the cheap food, the highly efficient global food systems, the cheap food, is precisely what we talked about earlier, and that is the cheap food is actually a function of complements of the oppression of people elsewhere and the degradation of environments. That's where the cheap food, the real cost of that food. So when people say to me, organic, we have an organic farm and have been organic for decades. And people will say to me, organic is all good, but it's too expensive. And that's true, but that's conflating price with value. And sure, it is in terms of price, it is often more expensive, local, organically grown food. On the other hand, if we're serious about the right to food, then the right to appropriate, nutritious food is surely part of that. It's not the right to junk, it's the right to to food, real nutritious food. So I'm totally on board with your view that these are systems of oppression that reinforce each other. The oppression of other people in other places who are even worse off than even a community in Toronto, let's say. Some other even more oppressed population is suffering what are the benefits of the cheap lettuce in the grocery store. So, you know, just to get that sort of organized in one's mind, that this is conflating the value of our environments and of our societies with the prices that are being offered by oppressors or oppressive systems. I was also reminded the other day, Valerie Tarasak, who is a researcher in food security policy research, did a little piece on CBC where she was quite succinct about who is suffering food insecurity during this pandemic. And one of the things she said, that almost 2/3 of the food insecure households in Canada are not households that are totally without work. They have income from employment. This tells you something about how wages and living costs are out of sync. And those people who say, well, food should be cheaper, should spare their breath and say, no, wages should be higher, an income should be guaranteed. The right to food means that you have those other systems in place where we take social responsibility for actually everybody having the right to the realized right to food and being able to exercise it. So it's a complex question. I'm always loath to say, oh, everybody should just grow their own food. Of course not. There isn't enough ground for all of us, and all of us in the country would miss those vibrant urban communities where other things can happen that we rely on culturally and socially. So absolutely not. More people should grow food. We should have more and smaller scale farms, that for sure. We could take better care of our communities. We could take better care of the earth. We could grow better food if that could be implemented. But it's not like going back. It's how we grow food and how it's distributed and who controls that distribution. So there's quite a few questions packed into that, but on the whole, it isn't as simple. If only good food was cheaper, everybody could buy it. No, wages would have to be higher, housing would have to be affordable, other social services and protections would have to be in place. Childcare among them.
And if I might just kind of piggyback off of that beautifully framed answer, Nettie, I feel like one of the pieces that you're really kind of highlighting, which I appreciate, is this idea that these systems level changes have the movement towards food sovereignty, the movement towards food security often has so little to do with food. Despite FoodShare being a food justice organization, so much of my work is about advocating for a higher minimum wage or advocating for increased job opportunities and not just job opportunities, because I mean, we also recognize that temporary low wage work isn't really empowering folks to overcome food insecurity, but kind of access to well-paid, stable, long-term employment for folks is also part of that struggle for folks to be able to support themselves in this on this road journey towards food security and that sort of thing. And I guess I also, in your conversation about growing food, wanted to highlight that for many folks, and actually myself included here, access to land is often a major barrier as well. And that is also linked to capital, right? Land is often really expensive for folks, and especially folks interested in going into farming or looking to become members of the farming community often it's prohibitive if you aren't able to either get a gigantic loan or have parents who can support you in that way, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's really complicated and often links well beyond this idea of food and food systems.
Can I just say one sentence harking back to the allyship? One of the ways in which we express solidarity with others who are not us is to understand those basic points of connection. For example, those of us who are not waged workers should always be lobbying for better minimum wages, whether we're minimum wage or not. That's solidarity.
Yeah, and it might feed into discussions. I know it's a complex question about, like a guaranteed annual income or like a baseline, or thinking about our taxation systems, thinking about so many things it connects with. And I think, Leslie, when you were talking about access to land, I mean, I would go back to this thing in urban areas that, I think they're actually, certainly Toronto and, Vancouver, especially around the Fraser Valley, are two of the richest, some of the richest agricultural land in Canada. Some of the cities are built on rich agricultural land, and yet people don't have access. Well, some people have access to it and grow lawns, and others just don't have access to it. They're living in large apartment buildings. It's hard to get a garden allotment. There aren't food forests. There aren't, we really need to also, we need to rethink how we farm, certainly in rural areas, and there's a major rethink, but also how we use urban space and how we create spaces within urban spaces to grow food, produce food, even with schools, so that kids have that experience of connecting with food in a more visceral way, being it both growing or preparing. Because I think that if we lose that connection as a child, then yes, it becomes like going to McDonald's and buying fast food, or just food comes from the grocery store, and losing that kind of connection. I'd like to kind of throw things out. I'm going to turn things over. I think Victoria is going to be picking up some of the questions from the audience. So I'll turn things over to Victoria now to share some questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Nettie and Leslie, for sharing your experience with us, but for also giving us some enlightening information about how food sovereignty is not really about food, but about dismantling a lot of oppressive systems that are keeping a lot of people from flourishing. So we've had a lot of good questions from the chat. I'm going to start with you, Leslie, and perhaps after Nettie, you can add your thoughts. But Leslie, you mentioned your work with FoodShare. You do a lot of research-based, and in that you found, specifically within the context of Toronto in Ontario, that Black and other marginalized communities are often more likely to suffer from food insecurity. But oftentimes we need data to show us the things that we already know. And a lot of this time, this data is collected by those who come from outside the community, i.e. The academic, mostly white male, who still control these circles. So in your work, perhaps you can share some of the things that you've done, or what you think we need to, how we can move forward to shift what we value to better reflect and affirm a wider diversity of lived experience and ways of knowing, so that we might move beyond this data when it's necessary.
That is an excellent, excellent question. So I think, I guess where I would pick that up is in thinking about what we as a society value. Because I think that this reliance on data, and I certainly don't want to be seen as saying that data is unimportant and should be thrown out, but I think that it's really important to recognize that data is one way of knowing something, one way of seeing the world, and that there are many other equally valid ways of knowing and seeing the world. And I mean, thinking back to my time in school, like if I hadn't been willing to adopt the kind of science-forward, data-based mindset, I wouldn't have received a Bachelor of Science. I couldn't have navigated that system unless I had taken on that value set. And in leaving school and in traveling internationally with that value set, then I began to see the damage that it can do to have an exclusively data-focused approach to work, because so many elements of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous teachings and ways of knowing are disconnected from data. They're connected with things like oral traditions and storytelling and kind of person-to-person knowledge transfer, as opposed to, we ran the study, we crunched the numbers, and it turns out 25% increase in crop yields or something like that. And so often the data that we collect reflects things that are already deeply understood through systems of traditional knowledge and through Indigenous understandings and that sort of thing. And so, for example, the work that we did at FoodShare looking at food insecurity in Canada, Nettie, I love that you shouted out Val Tarasuk, because she was also the principal investigator that we partnered with on this study looking at food insecurity within the Black community. And like I said in my introduction, like, FoodShare has been sitting with and listening to members from the Black community for many years, talking about the food insecurity concerns that they have and that they reflect. And I mean, there are many activists and leaders and shakers within this community that have been talking about these things for decades and calling attention to the fact that Black households are facing elevated rates of food insecurity and that that's a major problem for folks. But some folks were listening, but I'm sure that there were others who said, well, we haven't seen the data, so how can we really be sure? And because of a function of who gets to lead the solution finding process and the data collection process, then if you really drill down into it, it's often unsurprising that data on issues to do with minority communities is often really difficult to come by. If you think about who is running studies, it's often, in order to do a study, you need to get a grant. In order to get a grant, you often need to be associated with an academic institution. Maybe you're a professor, an associate professor, or a researcher. In order to get a position with an academic institution, you need to be able to get a degree. You need to be able to navigate a university system or grad school. Often folks who are perfectly qualified and would otherwise be able to access these systems either can't afford to go to university because they don't have the money, or are screened out in an application process that may be discriminatory, or basically just aren't in a position to lead that research. And so, if you look at university, if you look at kind of the demographics of student bodies in universities, and then you look at the demographics of who is in a position of professorship at a university, you will see that often, kind of within academic departments and institutions, there is much less racial diversity on faculties, and as a result, it is understandable that there might be blind spots or questions that aren't being asked by somebody who doesn't have that lived experience to ask that question or to look into, say, this issue that may have to do with a community that is completely separate from their own. And so in FoodShare's case, we were interested in doing the data because we knew that it was valuable, because our funders were asking us for it constantly. We were constantly being asked to prove, why are you disproportionately focusing your services on minority communities? What data can you show to support that this is valid? And so that was one of the things that drove us to do the study in the first place. And we found that I did a presentation presenting the results of this research in late October of last year. And the following week, FoodShare was on the front page of the Toronto Star. We got picked up by the Globe and Mail. A couple of days later, I heard the statistics on food insecurity within the Black community being quoted on the floor of provincial parliaments. And so it was as though this issue that people had been speaking about for years, all of a sudden, now that we had the numbers to back it up, then it was all of a sudden seen as valid and taken more seriously and picked up. And so this is not an issue that is exclusive to the Black community. This is an issue that I'm sure exists in many other communities, but in most cases, we don't have the data to back that up. And so the danger is that if we are exclusively reliant on this data-based decision-making, then we have the excuse to say, our hands are tied, we should not do anything until we get the data. And we don't know when that will be. And for many of these communities, these problems are so acute that we cannot afford to wait on that data before acting. We need to, I think, shift to alongside data, valuing the lived experience of people and what people are saying that they are seeing and experiencing, and seeing that as another valid way of validating decision-making. And I think that that would be a huge step in the right direction, and also be a step toward empowering communities that are less likely to be the focus of data collection activities currently.
Thank you for that. Nettie, I'm sure you would like to add.
Can I just add a big check mark to what I've just heard Leslie say here? This is very much the experience of women, that a lot of what women know, both in farming and in other aspects of life, is not actually in part of a database, and these knowledges, these ways of knowing, are hence discounted, and to the grave disadvantage of the body of knowledge. I mean, one of the problems with being so focused on one kind of knowledge, scientific knowledge, is that if you can't count it, or if it's not counted, then it is, by dint of that, being discounted. And that's that undermines and misunderstands how complex the relationships are, not just how important the numbers are. Of course, the numbers are important, but how complex the relationships are.
Thank you so much, Nettie and Leslie, for that. I think that goes back to the work that the forum tries to do, highlighting the importance of listening to people, and listening for the sake of listening, but not to argue with them. And from their lived experiences, how can we change together? So thank you for that. My next question is, a lot of us here are interested in food sovereignty, but sometimes these terms in themselves can be very complex. So could you share with us maybe a creative project that helps embody food sovereignty that you've come across or that you've worked on before? And perhaps, Nettie, you can start us off this time.
Yeah, I mean, we're not only do we farm and directly actually eat most of our own food and so on and so forth. So try and be as self-sufficient here as we can be. But I'm part of a farmers union, and we have continued in many ways to work for food sovereignty. For example, now during the pandemic, one of the threats to many of our members across the country was that they were shutting down farmers markets, but the supermarkets were open. And we argued vociferously and won in most contexts the argument that actually the farmers markets, as with the supermarkets, could be made to work so that the local food systems weren't shut down in favor of the big players. And I mean, there are lots of examples everywhere in every city of community gardening, of community shared agriculture, of integrating food, local food, into people's lives in an effective way. So yes, I've been part of a lot of that.
Thank you.
I guess, Nettie, I also feel like La Via Campesina and the wonderful work that they are championing is also a beautiful example of kind of food sovereignty and advocacy toward food sovereignty in practice. So I'd shout that out as well. I don't know that I have a specific example of a project that is working specifically to support food sovereignty that I have worked alongside. I think that one of the examples that I held up previously, Ada Blooms as a business that is kind of working to refocus and revalue the kind of ancient understandings of our foodways and revalue kind of species that may not be as commonly found in grocery stores or that sort of thing is one example of that. And in thinking back to our conversation about land and land access, I also wanted to kind of shout out an initiative that was started here in Toronto by a young person by the name of Cheyenne Sundance. And it was a project called Liberating Lawns that started, I believe, last year. And it basically looked at this major barrier in access to land that many folks face, specifically in the context of Toronto. And this program was set up whereby if you have a home with a yard, and then you can put it up on this platform, and other folks who seek to grow can also sign up to the platform and see where in the city there may be yards or homes or plots that are not being used, and where people would be open to having someone come and grow in their space. And so it was through this program that I, as somebody who was born and grew up here and has a ton of experience in agriculture, a master's degree studying tropical agriculture, but I've never had access to land in Canada until last summer. And so I was able to connect with somebody else in my neighborhood, built a beautiful garden with my partner, and for the first time was able to pull food out of the ground that I had grown with my own hands, despite the fact that I have spent almost a decade working internationally alongside farming communities, doing farming, but again, returning home here to Canada, but facing barriers to access the resources that I need to be food sovereign, to be food secure myself because of access to resources and access to land. And so I think it's initiatives like Liberating Lawns and others that are really kind of drilling into this question of what are the barriers that folks face in accessing food, in accessing resources, in accessing land, in accessing what they need, and how do we design a system to overcome those barriers? And I feel like that is a beautiful example of that.
Thank you for that. I also find that access to land is a huge barrier, just because we're so detached from our food, but from what gives us life, the soil that goes into to creating our foods, and so I think that's a huge step that we need to take is going out into the land and learning what has always been there. We don't need to recreate it. So I have one last question. The COVID pandemic has perhaps prompted reflection and attention on the global food system. It is a time to sow the seeds for a more sustainable long-term recovery, reducing the likelihood of future pandemics and enhancing society's resilience. Just as the world needs to build back better from this crisis, we also have to grow back better. So my question to both of you is, are you hopeful that change is on the horizon? If so, why or why not? And could you maybe share examples of where you have seen some of the best practices being realized?
Am I hopeful? Yes, of course I'm hopeful. I'm not very optimistic that we'll learn all of the things that we need to learn from this pandemic, but hope is about aspiring to things we can imagine and have not yet experienced, and it's not always based on the database, actually. The trend lines are not happy. The trend lines, and we recently had friends of mine did a study on land consolidation, for example, in the prairie region, and it is proceeding at a pace, which means that there will be fewer and fewer small-scale farmers and more investor or corporate-owned land, and more monoculture, none of which is going in the right direction, more consolidation. On the other hand, there is both here in Canada, in our neighborhoods, and around the world, a recognition that the way in which the food system has been organized is in fact unsustainable on many levels, socially and economically and ecologically unsustainable. So there is tremendous pressure in many places, including here, to try and take back some control. For example, we're right now as a farmers union in BC lobbying hard and actually getting off the ground the reestablishment of smaller abattoirs, which will challenge the concentration that I talked about earlier, the concentration in the beef industry. So there are many examples where people, and this is of course socially organized. It's awareness of what can be done and organization around doing it, but where people are realizing that we can in fact not continue in the way in which we're going now, and that both in terms of our social and our health and our cultural life and our agricultural life, we have to do things differently. In the Via Campesina and across Canada, we're talking about a different way of producing, agroecological agriculture rather than industrial high input agriculture. And there's more and more data and more examples of how very productive and how very ecologically healthy that those kinds of food producing systems can be, those kinds of farms can be. So it's not a threat to food security in terms of not enough food being produced, and it is definitely a way better and more sustainable, regenerative way of producing the food we all need. So those are a few examples.
Thank you.
Oh, all of these are such big questions. I am an eternal optimist as well. I think that it's important to have hope, even when you cannot necessarily see your way through to what the solution might look like. COVID has been such a weird experience, I think, for all of us in many ways. And I think that we've seen that one of the things that this crisis has done is that it's really held up to the light a lot of the holes and the gaps and the failings of the systems on which we were relying. And I think that that's manifested when I walk on the street and after work, and I look right now. Toronto is in a lockdown, and so those who can are asked to work from home. But there are still folks who are working in the grocery stores and stocking shelves. And when I look at the buses passing on transit, and I look at who is in those bus seats, it is disproportionately women. It is disproportionately women of color. Black and brown women who are not in a position to have the luxury of working from home. And so I think that it really comes down to, like, are we willing, as we see these things that are being held up to the light, to make the changes that need to happen? Are folks in power willing to give up some of that power in service of better systems that work more equitably for more people? And I also think that it's important to recognize that this solution is not going to come from food banks. It's not going to come from food justice organizations like Food Share, because we don't have the resources to solve problems like poverty, to address issues like the pernicious impacts of capitalism. Food Share can't increase the minimum wage in Ontario, but the government can. And as a result, it's really important for folks to recognize that advocacy to government is one of the key levers that can be pushed in kind of advocating for well-being. because it is often the government that has the resources to make systems level changes that we need as we move towards systems that work better for folks. And in framing the charitable sector, in framing food banks or food justice organizations as the solution to food insecurity, then the government is abdicating its responsibility for upholding the right to food for all Canadians. And I think maybe it would be appropriate to leave us with or to end off with a quote that I came across recently by a Black feminist scholar and body positive academic, Sonia Renee Taylor. And the quote goes like this. She says, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was never normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." And I feel like that just really beautifully kind of brings together some of these conversations about the impact of this, of the coronavirus and its impact on our systems, but also as, I mean, we are at a crossroads. We are at a time of incredible opportunity to build back and to build back better and to grow back better. And it's sort of, I think, down to us and to kind of the people to hold the systems that we pay taxes for accountable to upholding those commitments and to supporting us in building back better.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think that's a beautiful quote to end with. If COVID has taught us anything, it's that if the political power and will to change is there, that we can do things we didn't think were possible before. Thank you for that. I'm just going to pass it over to Mark, who is going to finish our conversation.
Yes, it's been an amazing conversation. I love that quote, Leslie. I mean, it reminds me a few months back at the Jesuit Forum, we have a publication called Open Space, and we did one. I think we called it a Pangolins, Pandemics, and Portals, but precisely that kind of hope that, you know, this pandemic can be a moment of reflection to kind of think not so much even about just recovery. I don't like the word recovery because recovery sounds a little bit to me too much like going back. I want to just transition. I want to go someplace else, you know. And so I think food sovereignty is a really important part of that. So I thank both of you for your reflections on this today. And something that I think we had mentioned, I'd forgotten to ask, it's just very brief, if you could suggest one film, article, or book for people to follow up on, if you just briefly mention if there's something that you think if people want to find out more about this, what is it? What would be a good thing to be reading or watching or looking at?
Nettie seems like she has a quick answer. Maybe you can go first.
I was one of the co-editors of several books on food sovereignty, one food sovereignty in Canada, one food sovereignty globally. So if you just want to, those are almost a decade old, but they give you the overview of the lay of the land. But for now, these are these two books, this one and this one. For now, I would say if you want to just think about food sovereignty and what's going on in the world and here around those questions, go to a website, nihaleni.org, and they publish not monthly, quarterly newsletter or bi-yearly newsletter on food sovereignty initiatives here, there, and everywhere, on the ground stories and dialogue, and just a very nice discussion, current, global, and hopeful.
Thank you, Nettie. And Leslie?
So I am reminded of a book that I just picked up from the library 2 or 3 days ago. I'd been on the waiting list for many, many months, and so I was really excited. But it's a book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It's one that many folks have recommended. And the byline is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. And as someone with a background in plant science and someone who strives to educate myself further on Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding and navigating the world, then this book, I'm just beginning, but it is beautifully weaving together that message around kind of so much of what we are seeking in science is already known and understood within Indigenous communities. And it's important to think about, again, these different ways of knowing and valuing and opportunities to learn from our sort of human and non-human companions here in our systems. So yeah, Braiding Sweetgrass would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Leslie. That is indeed a wonderful book. And actually, it kind of follows into something that we just want to mention, that as the Jesuit Forum, we've been working and we'll be launching in March a dialogue guide called Listening to Indigenous Voices. And actually, there's a piece of Robin Wall Kimmerer in that guide, but it's really, it draws on a lot of different Indigenous authors and artists from particularly from this part of Turtle Island that we call Canada, but also a bit wider than that, but mainly from that area. And we'd really really hoping that it will get out and spark a lot of dialogue. It can be used in high schools as well as with adult groups. And I'm also just going to put up a poll quickly here, which I'm going to launch before people leave today, just asking a few questions about whether you'd be interested to be on our mailing list, or we're also hoping to do a follow-up webinar to this one on that topic as well, on Indigenous food sovereignty. We're hoping to put something together in February. And so, yeah, and we also are looking for people who might be interested in working through this guide, Living with Limits, Living Well, which really has to do with that whole a different paradigm of thinking about economy, which I really think goes hand in hand with food sovereignty. So thank you once again so much to both Leslie and Nettie. I mean, you were a great. I thought that you were really nice complementarity, like commonality and difference and dialogue, and just so much richness really in this conversation. And I also like to thank all the people who have been here today and listening and participating. We hope to see you again. We hope to, on our next webinar on food sovereignty, on our launch event for Listening to Indigenous Voices, and to follow us on our website and things as well. But this is such an important topic, and for people to really find ways of living out this food sovereignty ethic in one's life and becoming an ally with these movements, working for a different way of being in the world, different food systems. So with that, I'll draw things to a close, but our gratitude is very, very deep to both of you.
Thank you. It was a privilege.
Likewise, yes. And I guess I also wanted to thank you folks for creating the space to have this conversation, because I think that creating the space to share these ideas is often just as important as the ideas being shared. So yes, it's been wonderful to share space with you all, and wonderful to meet you, Nettie. Hopefully we can keep in touch.
Okay, so thanks to all, and we'll be signing off now, and hope to see you again in February when we do the next webinar on Indigenous food sovereignty.